Hello, my name is Joppe and the work I've chosen is Bezette Stad by Paul van Ostaijen. Paul van Ostaijen was a Belgian poet born in Antwerp. He belonged to the Flemish movement. As he aspired a collaborative Europe, he saw the fight for Flemish independence as part of this international socialist battle. Generally, van Ostaijen was known as the pioneer that set the avant-garde movement in Belgium in motion. His search for new art can be seen in some of his most significant work. In musical, van Ostaijen vouches for the desindividualization of art. He describes the Antwerp nightlife as one being. In Het Signaal, van Ostaijen continues his search for the new. He breaks with traditional norms and vouches for a new typographic design. In 1918, van Ostaijen fled to Berlin in fear of prosecution for German collaboration. Here, he experienced a period of great artistic productivity. He came in contact with a lot of avant-gardes and gained inspiration from magazines like Der Storm and Die Action. It was in this period that he wrote the work I'm focusing on, Bezette Stad. Of course, Bezette Stad was written and composed by van Ostaijen. However, the work was much more a collaboration between two artists, as his friend Oscar Jespers was responsible for the visual and typographical design of the poem. Jespers designed his own big, stick-like letters in order to fit van Ostaijen's work. He cut the letters himself out of palm wood. Jespers also designed woodcuts for the title pages of the individual poems. One of them you can see here. This is the title page for the poem within Bezette Stad I'm focusing on, Holle. If we objectively look at this poem and only describe it, a few remarks can be made. If we look at the poem, we see that it is 11 pages long and consists of black and white letters. Striking is the diversity in font and size, which you can see here. Furthermore, there are a lot of blank spaces between sentences and words. Also, the lines of the poem are very striking. They almost appear to climb and fall down. If we read the poem, we see that there appears to be a je or you that is describing something. Also, there appear to be a lot of signs, like zum halben Kilo or Rio Janeiro. Furthermore, there appear to be some sort of calligrams, or at least a relation between form and meaning. If we listen to the poem, there appears to be a lot of sound production. Van Ostaijen tried to capture this in his rhythmic typography, as he liked to call it. Examples are the gehoo-hoo of the birds, where a clear relation between sound and typography can be seen. Or take the verroeste sloten. Occupied City first appeared as a book published by Het Signaal in Antwerp in 1921. Het Signaal was the publishing house of Van Ostaijen's artistic society, Bond zonder verzegeld papier. Among others, this society consisted of van Ostaijen, of course, and the brothers Oscar and Floris Jespers. The publisher's house was located in the parental home of the Jespers brothers. The poetry collections Het Signaal, which I mentioned earlier, was the first publication of the publisher's house. It was visual artist Floris Jespers who designed the cover for this collection. The publisher's house was, of course, named after this collection. Expressionism is one of the movements that Hollow Harbor can be linked to. Look, for example, at the typography, which is very dynamic. Furthermore, signs of thematic coherence can be seen, as the poem is about the destructive forces of war. Also, the work shows signs of expressionist activism. It wants to speak for a generation that vouches for a new world after the war. Holle can also be linked to Cubism. Take the visual organization of language. Examples are the sort of calligrams and signboards I talked about before. Also, the poem shows multiple perspectives. As we will see later, the old and new harbor are both depicted and almost blend together. Futurism is also an option. There's a fascination for modernity in the representation of the harbor. And the poem has destroyed syntax. Look at the blank spaces I mentioned before. The poem is also Dadaesque, as it shows the general characteristic of living in a destructed world. And it has a bit of humor. In general, Bezette Stad is about the German occupation of Antwerp during the First World War. In Holle specifically, we appear to see a harbor that was once a place of liveliness and activity before the war. Now it has been destroyed and an empty, abandoned harbor remains. If we look at the poem, it appears that the je or you I mentioned before walks through the harbor. Could this maybe be van Ostaijen? This narrator looks at the empty harbor and ironically thinks of it as a museum, one only needs to add a couple of wax dolls and signs for it to be ready for the upcoming World Exhibition in Milwaukee. The narrator walks on. He looks at the harbor before him, and it makes him think of a painting Floris Jespers made of the harbor before the war. The narrator seems to color the scenery before him with this memory he has of the painting. His memory and reality almost seem to blend together in this part of the poem. As the narrator walks further, it is really interesting to see how Van Ostaijen shows the destruction in his poem. We see signboards of the harbor before the occupation, I mentioned earlier, like Rio Janeiro and Zum halben Kilo. This is what the harbor must have looked like while it was still operating. Later, Van Ostaijen shows the same signs, but in a different manner. First they appeared in its entirety, now only half of them remain. Zum halben Kilo has become Zum halb. It is as if they've been shot at during the occupation. Van Ostaijen thus seems to call upon the imagery of the war by showing a destructed harbor. The harbor is no longer solid, it is hollow. In my analysis, I will focus on 2 chapters of the course book. For the first chapter, about cities, it is interesting that Van Ostaijen writes tentaculaire herinnering. This is a reference to the idea to view the city as a monster with tentacles, that is, as it is constantly busy. Van Ostaijen seems to say that he views the city differently now. In the poem, Van Ostaijen constantly compares the harbor before the war with the harbor after the war. He uses the past for his understanding of the present. Does he, as is described in chapter 7 of our course book, appear to appropriate the past to fit the present? That is what I will focus on in my essay.